We're very happy to have everyone here this evening, students, faculty, distinguished guests from around the world, colleagues from the school and outside of the university. I especially want to welcome a high-level delegation from the Chinese University of Communication that is here, and I would like for them to stand for just a moment and be welcomed, if they would stand up, from Beijing. Thank you. We're engaged in a far-ranging form of cooperation with them, and we're delighted to welcome them here to LA in the same way they welcomed us to Beijing. This is a historic moment, as all of you know, for the coming together of the present and the future of journalism in this great country. There are issues of finance, there are issues of organization, and ultimately, we believe at the Annenberg School these are also issues of democracy, because without a strong and free and independent press, there can be no strong and free democracy. So this is something that we take very, very seriously. We're delighted especially to have this evening Tom Rosenstiel, who is here to talk about this issue, the new media culture. But he's going to report on some very interesting and some very important work that he has led, a research effort that is really informing a lot of the conversation that's taking place among serious people in the world of media change. I do want to say just a brief word about what we're doing here at the Annenberg School for Communication. For the past 22 months, we've been working on what we call a re-envisioning Annenberg. What should the Annenberg School for Communication look like in the 21st century? How do we not only address the issues that are coming up, but how do we lead them and anticipate and to help shape them? And the phrase that we've come up with for the moment that will guide our discussion among students and stakeholders beyond the university is that we are an innovative, full-service school in a networked university in the most global city in the United States of America. And we take the idea of being a full-service school very seriously in terms of our research, our teaching, and our service. We offer BA degrees and MA degrees and PhDs and mid-career services as well. So we're delighted that you've come to join us this evening. It's our job really to prepare the next generation of journalists and people in communications to do the important work that they have to do. This is a responsibility of the press, but it's also a responsibility of journalism schools. I posted a little blog, I guess I'll promote my own little bit of journalism there, my own post, criticizing to a certain extent journalism schools, because we bear some of the responsibility for the current state of the field of journalism, of the profession, of the calling of journalism. And certainly here at the Annenberg School and my colleagues at other great journalism schools around the country are really have to step up the work that we do, the contribution that we make to solving the problems and seizing the opportunities that confront journalism in our day and in our time. Leading the charge here at the Annenberg School for Communication in the field of journalism is one of America's great journalism educators, editors, and public intellectuals in the field of the future of journalism. We were delighted to be able to recruit Geneva Overholzer here from one of our competitor sister schools, where she was a named professor. And since she has been here, she has brought with her a very rare combination. She has brought the knowledge and experience in the legacy media, on the one hand, but also with the kind of impatience that says we have got to move very, very rapidly into the digital world. We can't just rely on the past. And she has done a wonderful job in helping to lead her school and the whole school into that great future. And so without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the podium Geneva Overholzer.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction and that fine welcome. I really am delighted to see this crowd here, and you're in for a terrific evening, I know that. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Rosenstiel, who is many things, including a good friend of mine of long standing and a good friend of many others here at the school. If you weren't able to reach him at the reception because he was talking to so many old friends, I can assure you that we're working him to the bone, and he'll be in many of your classes. I know some of you have met with him already today in a couple of classes, so don't despair. In addition to being a friend to many of us, he is a journalist of long standing and great distinction, including for many years at the Los Angeles Times, where I first came to know his work when he was one of the really early and fine media writers. He also did political reporting for the LA Times, was a congressional correspondent for Newsweek. He's also a muckraker, and he earns the title by having worked for the muckraker Jack Anderson himself. He's an author. I'd be amazed if most of you in this room have not read The Elements of Journalism, which Tom wrote with Bill Kovach, who is another good friend of our school. He's written several other books as well. He's an innovator. He was a co-founder of the Committee of Concerned Journalists, which back in the mid-90s was born to address, I'm afraid I'm going to sound like Jimmy Carter, a sense of malaise or a certain unsettlement in the journalism world, which has contributed to leading us to where we are today. But he and Bill, instead of sitting around wringing their hands, gathered a group of people to think about what concerned journalists might do. And Tom effectively ran that organization until quite recently. He's an entrepreneur, a word we have all come to love and embrace here at Annenberg. He conceived of and put together the Project for Excellence in Journalism, whose work you're going to learn a lot more about tonight. But he really did, again, look at a landscape in change and think about what might be a fruitful way to address that change. He's a commentator and pundit par excellence. He's much in demand on the radio and television and in print. And he is an academic. He is himself a professor of journalism studies at that university that Ernie didn't mention, the Missouri School of Journalism, where he was a colleague of mine in Washington. He's also a native Californian, and we are delighted to welcome Tom home and to have him here as our Hearst visiting professional. I also want, in one last point, to thank Roberto Suro, who is a very good friend of Tom's and really made this happen. So thanks to Roberto, and welcome to Tom.
Well, I'm a native Californian, but I have to say that I'm a San Franciscan, and so I'm always a little uncomfortable here. It's on fire. The baseball caps are the wrong color. I'm monitoring the Giants game. Just signed off on their head, by the way, in case you care. What I'm going to do for the next, we've got about 90 minutes, right? So for the half of that time, I'm going to move fairly quickly across what's going on in the media landscape right now, and throw out a lot of ideas, fairly abstract and broad ones, with some information backing them up, but not a lot of nuts and bolts, not a lot of data. That hopefully will prompt a robust conversation afterwards. I think the best part of these sort of evenings are listening to you and talking about the things that you're concerned with. So what we're going to do for the next half hour, 40 minutes, hopefully will just be a table setter for the conversation that will follow. This slide tells you what happened to audiences at the various media sectors in 2008, the last year for which we have full data. And as you can see here, cable saw a 38% increase in its audience. I believe that's prime time, but it could be all-day parts. It didn't vary a lot. They grew all the way across the day. This is the top 50 news websites. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's in the top 50 news websites later. But suffice to say that it's actually more than 50 websites, because the way that this data is collected by ComScore, the Tribune Company is one website. It's a family of all the McClatchy papers are there. So it's really more than that, but it's the major news organization. And they grew 27% in traffic in 2008. Radio, this is probably a little bit of a soft number. It could be basically flat. It could be down a little bit depending on how you count it.
Tom, you put your mic switch off in your pocket. You just go back and turn it on the
The
video.
green light is on. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I talk so loud, you can probably hear me now. Network TV dropped a little bit, less than it usually does, frankly. Just a few 100,000, and it's been down more like 1 million a year for the last 20 years. Local TV a little more, newspapers and magazines a little more, but not a lot. We're talking about 6% declines. Okay, so that's what's happening with audiences. This is what's happening with revenue. This is what happened to advertising and spending by those same sectors. Cable was up, not as much as the audience, but up a lot. Online, big increase in audience, right? 27%, 4% increase in ad revenue. And almost all of this is outside of news. Almost all of this is in search. Network TV, small drop. Local TV, big drop. Newspapers and magazines, much larger drops in revenue than in audience. So what is this basic data? And I could give you, believe me, I could have, those 2 slides, we could have talked for 4 hours about those previous 2 slides. But that's a lot less interesting lecture. What that information tells us right off the bat is that journalism's problem is not fundamentally an audience problem. A few years ago, if you were a reader of Wired magazine, you would have heard or read that as the media were going to break up and the oligarchy was going to end, people were going to flee away from traditional news values, and traditional news destinations. The long tail was going to be, at the back end of the tail, much, much larger in terms of how many people went to all those small little websites than were going to go to the mainstream press. Once people were rid of the filter, the old thinking, objectivity, and all the norms of that annoying stuff that journalists believe in, it would be a new day and we'd have a new kind of truth, a wiki world of journalism. That's not what happened. That's not at least what is happening. Journalism's problem is fundamentally a revenue problem. The internet, for reasons that I will talk about in a minute, is decoupling advertising from news. Traditional news operations are seeing their operations grow. And in that growth, the biggest news operations are actually getting bigger. I showed you that chart. The top 50 news websites grew by 27%. The top 700 news websites, including these top 50, grew by only 7%. What's in the top 50? The TV networks, all the major newspapers, all the major newspaper chains, all the traditional news operations. In that top 50, there are only 2 news destinations that you would consider alternative news destinations: Drudge and the Huffington Post. And by the way, what's on Drudge and the Huffington Post? A lot of wire copy is really a key part of their draw. The long tail is long, but it is thin. Despite that growth, online revenue is flattened. At newspapers, online revenue actually declined in 2008, despite giant spikes in audience. Last year, the price of an online display ad fell by 48% as audiences surged. Why? A variety of reasons, but one of them is simply there's no scarcity. There are so many websites out there, that you cannot charge very much. Also, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, display advertising online doesn't work very well. Consider the New York Times. And those of you who have already heard me a little bit today have heard some of this. The New York Times has, and this number is now out of date, it's closer to 17 million. 17 million unique visitors online every month. What does that mean? That's 17 million different people visit the New York Times website at least once in a month. That's not visits, that's different people, okay? The New York Times has a circulation of 1.2 million in print. Now that's 1.2 million copies. Pass along how many people read it only occasionally in the course of the month. How many different people read the New York Times in print in a month? It's a complicated set of math guesses. But basically, I would put that number at 7 or 8 million different readers in a month at the New York Times. Now probably all of them also go to that website. Even with that, the New York Times has probably doubled its audience online. So half of its readers are now online only. And yet, the New York Times makes 90% of its revenue from print, from the part of the newspaper that's shrinking. It's only making 10% online, and it's having a heck of a time keeping that number at 10%. It can't succeed in getting it higher. Audiences are migrating online, but advertisers are not. And by all appearances, they're not going to. The economic accident that subsidized journalism in the 20th century is literally evaporating. In the 19th century, journalism wasn't subsidized by commercial advertising. We didn't have an industrial revolution yet. You didn't have goods that were sold the same way. And newspapers, by and large, tended to be controlled by political parties and were operated at a loss to advance a party need. The notion that a newspaper could be truly independent and finance itself largely by advertising began to occur in the 1890s and really took root in the 20th century, and it made the newspaper business and the news business generally better, more professional, more independent. People like to bemoan advertising as a corrupting force, but actually, if you look back historically, as long as you had enough different advertisers, it actually ensured more independence from the press than we'd ever had before. So you had this commercial thing that accidentally subsidized a civic good, journalism. It made information for citizens more plentiful. It made the country more knowledgeable. Journalism wasn't always great, but more information independently produced a better, more knowledgeable public. That subsidy is disappearing. Why is that happening? Well, the first one is that many advertisers don't need the press as an intermediary to reach their audience. If you're Best Buy, you don't need the Sunday inserts to fall out of the Sunday paper to tell people what's on sale at Best Buy. I can go at 3 in the morning to Best Buy and not just see what's on sale, I could actually buy them. The second thing is that the way we read a newspaper or watch TV is dramatically different than the way we interface with information online. Just think about this for a minute. When you're reading a newspaper, you're having a relationship with that one news organization. What do they have to tell me? And the research is very clear. We look at the news, and we also look at the ads, and the ads are another kind of content. And in newspapers in particular, ads with a lot of detail that tell us, oh, this is on sale for the next 4 days, and there's the price, and there's the SKU number, and all that other stuff. That's content in a newspaper ad. It's not image advertising, or it didn't used to be. Think of that ad, for those of you who ever actually look at the New York Times in print, for J&R computers. They must have 50 computers in the picture. It's a full-page ad most days in the New York Times with amazing amount of agate detail about how, what the computer's memory is and how much it costs and how long it'll be on for that price. Now, think about the way you interface with information online. Online, we are hunter-gatherers. not having a relationship with one news organization, but frequently just looking for answers to our specific questions. When you Google something, you want to find out, okay, how many movies was Kevin Bacon in, or what was, the answer to this, or who invented that, or I want to find out about this news story today. Why was Charlie Gibson stepping down and replaced by Diane Sawyer? And you'll hunt through all the stories that might come up in your search, picking the one that answers your search best. You're looking for answers to your question. You're hunting and gathering. In that context, a search ad is complementary to that activity. It's another form of content that's a lot like what you're doing. But when you finally reach the link that you want and you click on it, you've got to the good stuff. The pop-up ad, the display ad, the thing that that comes up instead of the content is an intrusion. It's not complementary to the activity you're engaged in. It's actually antithetical to it, which is a major reason that display advertising isn't working online. And the other reason, the other third major factor, is that the legacy media has missed opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to take advantage of this new technology as a revenue source. I can go on and on about the examples. Craigslist, Realtor.com, even Google. These were all opportunities that the news industry had. In some cases, in the case of Google, the LA Times had the opportunity to actually buy Google and turned it down. They decided that search and aggregation were not journalism. Now, Google today would probably not be Google had it been bought by Times Mirror. I mean, hypotheticals are dangerous, but I was at meetings with Geneva where people were talking about this technology, particularly the internet and online advertising, is an opportunity for the newspaper industry and the news business. It's not a threat. You've got to look at it that way. Think of a real estate ad online and how deep and rich it can be versus those 3 lines of lies that are in your newspaper about that shady bungalow, which is actually a dreadful house you don't want to live in. Think about the virtual tour you could take. Newspaper industry couldn't get its mind around those things. Opportunity after opportunity passed it by. So those 3 things have led to this revenue problem. Okay, with that as an economic background, what's going on in the news culture that you're teaching about and that you students are learning about? Well, one is that the business is beginning to focus somewhat more on not bringing people into a specific website, but in pushing content out. The media culture is now a rapidly moving stream, and if you can get material into that stream, you can be successful. You do not have to bring them to your website. Consider this. 2/3 of the traffic to the New York Times website doesn't arrive there by people going to the New York Times. It gets there through the side door, by people getting through links, people emailing them specific stories, search engines, and other things. It's not people saying, oh, what is the New York Times going to tell me today? It's people saying, I wonder what's going on with X. And they end up at the New York Times. Partnership is becoming a major focus of news investment and the way things work. And it may offer prospects for the financial future of news. The watchword in the news business today is do what you do best and borrow the rest. Why? Because as you're shrinking your newsroom, if you want to stay competitive, people are deciding what is the one thing that they can do that's their franchise brand, the thing that they can own, that they can really master. Because it's so easy to collect and pass along and attach yourself to all the other good things that are out there. Drudge Report is a major factor online. What's he got? A few links, a few little scoops a day. Mostly it's links. And the other thing, the other big trend, is that more power, not all the power, by no means the majority of power, but to some extent, power is shifting to the individual journalist and away by degrees from the institution. If getting good content into that rapidly moving stream is important, then one person's good content can get into that stream and get an audience. You don't need to work at the LA Times anymore to be a significant journalist in LA. That was not so true when I came here in 1983. Imagine if Paul Krugman left the New York Times. Would he become an anonymous Princeton professor again? I don't think so, not if he continued to write that column. What if Tom Friedman left the New York Times, or David Brooks, perhaps more importantly? Any place he was, I suspect, would be important. It's now David Brooks who's important. Yes, it's useful that he's at the New York Times for him, but it may be more useful to the New York Times today than it is to David Brooks. A word about cable news, because it was the biggest bar on those two charts. I think it's having an effect. I think that the success of cable in the last election is having a lasting impact on our politics, at least at the moment. Certainly the president seems to think so. When he talks about television loves a ruckus, he's not really talking about Charlie Gibson. Cable news has focused itself around a singular subject. 2/3 of the time on cable news last year was dedicated to the election. 2/3. There are really only 3 or 4 stories a day that are covered in any way on cable news. The rest of it is basically reading wire copy. When you cover one thing that intensively over all day for 18 hours of programming day, you cover every little thing that moves. And that has translated into the way we evaluate politics, or at least the way the political community evaluates politics. The other thing that cable does is to fill all that time, they're not using journalists. They're using basically surrogates to fill the time, some of whom are called CNN analysts, but most of whom have a dog in the hunt. They are either working for Obama or Clinton or whoever. It's very difficult, I think, for the most part, to find people who, among those analysts, who are not essentially mobbed up, not made men in one form or another. We did analyses of this during the campaign year and found that basically 60% of the airtime was handed over to people who were doing talking points or were themselves political officials. The other thing that I think is happening to our politics as a consequence of this is that we're seeing a kind of instant judgment. The notion that the president had 100 days honeymoon this year, I think, is antiquated beyond belief. We saw content in which, after 2 weeks, the president was being described on cable as having a failed presidency. He was still at 70% approval at the time, but the other major thing I would say, and this has already come up in one of the 2 classes I've already talked to, is that the reportorial press, and we really have 2 parts of our media culture now. One is the reportorial press, is what we think of as the old traditional idea of journalists going out and gathering information, and the other is the conversational media, people discussing the news after the fact. That conversational media is becoming more robust, healthier, more diverse, more exciting, and more important. The reportorial press, however, is under threat. It's the part that's financed by commercial advertising. It's the part that requires $1 million a year to maintain a bureau in Iraq or now Afghanistan. It's the hard part. It's the professional part. And what's happening in newsrooms is they're shrinking. And at the same time that they're shrinking, the people in those newsrooms now have more to do. They have to feed the website on an ongoing basis through the day. They have to shoot video. They have to shoot audio. There are members of this overworked press in the room today, and I see them either nodding their heads or nodding off. I can't tell which. But as your newsroom shrinks and you have more to do, and the people that you cover have become more sophisticated about how to manipulate their message and control their message, what we have is a phenomenon in which the press has become more reactive, more passive, more of a conduit for the people they cover, in some ways more of an enabler of the people they cover, and less of an enterprising investigator turning over rocks, proactively setting or influencing the agenda. To give you just a couple of examples, in 1992, a high watermark, I think, for political reporting, enterprise political reporting, the LA Times sent 2 people to live in Little Rock, Arkansas for 18 months to investigate everything, to find out whatever they could about Bill Clinton, the eventual winner of the race. In 2008, the paper produced 1/3 the number of enterprise stories that they did 16 years earlier. The Washington Post, David Marinas, in that same year, 1992, did 13 major biographical profiles of the eventual winner, Bill Clinton. Just Marinas alone, 13. In 2008, the Washington Post did 3 major biographical profiles of the eventual winner, Barack Obama. And Marinas, who is only part-time at the newspaper now, did 1 of the 3. I can give you lots and lots of statistics that suggest this. But basically, if your political staff is half the size it was, and they're doing a lot more things all through the day, they're not spending the same amount of time following their own agenda. And I think that this is a major and largely unseen element that's shaping our politics now. And then this last point here. The dominant metaphor for what journalists did in the 20th century was the gatekeeper, right? We've all heard that. Does anybody raise your hand if you've heard the press is the gatekeeper? Most hands. Okay. The notion of the gatekeeper was captured well in a quote by Walter Lippmann in a book called Liberty in the News, in which he says that the journalists are there to sift through the gossip, the innuendo, the rumor, and the fact that flow through the newsroom. I'm mangling the quote a little bit because my memory's shot now. And he called it one of the sacred and priestly acts in a democratic society. So sifting through the stuff and letting the facts go out to the public, minding that gate. Oh, you're a rumor. You stay in here with the newsroom. We'll titter about you in the bar later. You're a fact. You can go through the gate. That notion is now obsolete. We may have a gate here, but the fence is torn down on both sides. The idea that I'm the only venue by which a newsmaker can reach the public is completely obsolete. In 2008, 2007, I think this began, a film crew came from CNN to do a small documentary about Barack Obama. Obama's people said, you know what, instead of doing a documentary for CNN about us, why don't you come work for us and do documentaries for us? And that crew formed the spine of the group that produced all the videos that went on the YouTube channel, the Obama YouTube channel. By the time the election was held, 1 billion Obama videos had been viewed on YouTube. That's the future president communicating directly to the public without the press being involved at all. So what is the role of a journalist? What is the role that you, the students who are here, are going to play in a 21st century journalism if you can't be a gatekeeper, if you can't determine what the public knows and doesn't know? I'm sure you can add to this list and improve on this. But here are a few concepts that when I talk to journalists, I hear them saying they aspire to. The first one is an authenticator. A journalist is somebody who sifts through all the accounts that people have heard not sift through the accounts in the newsroom, and helps the public know which of these things can I believe. So we're no longer ignoring all the things that people might have heard. We're sifting through them for the audience and helping them know which ones are trustworthy and why. Another element of this, which I think journalists have aspired to in the past, in the older model, is to be a sense maker. Help me make sense of the news. What does it mean? Now, this is one of the reasons that the Bill O'Reillys and the Keith Olbermanns of the world have become so important, because they create the illusion for their audiences that they're helping them make sense of things, although they always end up making sense of things the same way every day. But for traditional journalists, for journalists who want to play a more independent role, this is a very important role and a more challenging one, because instead of sort of just whipping up a souffle of a little bit of quotes from some experts and calling it an interpretive piece the next day, the sense-making you do, the story that helps the tumblers click for your audience, is really helping your audience, not lecturing to your audience in a way that we haven't seen before. The watchdog role is very important in this. It's no less important than it's ever been. It may be even more important. If the press is in some ways more of a transmission belt than it used to be because it's doing fewer of some other things, this is an important way to do branding, to create commercial appeal, to justify your existence. It's certainly no less important than it's ever been, even in a world where there appears to be more information. Now we are also, however, a forum leader, helping citizens organize and talk among themselves. Hopefully, a discussion that is more grounded in facts than one that might occur somewhere else. The press is also a role model. As journalists are, as citizens are going out and doing more of their own journalism, they're inevitably looking to the people who've been doing this all these years to say, how do you do it? A newspaper in Kansas has even set up a curriculum with the local university to teach people who aspire in the community to perform journalism how to do it. And that the local faculty and people from the newspaper are there, the newspaper people are there, because if there's some people who are good at this, who come through this program, they want to use them. And the press is also a smart aggregator. What do I mean by smart aggregator? Well, smarter than Google, in the sense that Google's wonderful if you want to find out 2,000 stories on every subject. But if you don't want to have an option of 2,000, you'd like to actually have 5 that might be really valuable. And by the way, Google is not very useful at a local level. Google's great for finding 2,000 stories about the major story of the day. But if you want to find out something about your town, it's not that easy. If you live in Boise, Idaho, Google search is not necessarily going to be that helpful. So this thing that the LA Times thought, well, we're not in that business, now they're in that business. One other point about this sense-making, and I used this line in one of the classes that I talked to today. The era of the gatekeeper, the old metaphor for the press, was what I would call the trust me era of journalism. CBS News has learned. I'm telling you, I've vetted it, you can take my word for it, trust me. Walter Cronkite, who passed away, a very wonderful man, for those of us who were lucky enough to brush up against him, used to sign off his newscast by saying, and that's the way it is. If you can imagine, that would be like a Saturday Night Laugh line today if a newscaster said, and I'm telling you the way it is. That was the epitome of the trust me era of journalism. We don't have to share too much with you about how we did this because you trust us. Today we are in the era of show me journalism. Why should I believe you? Show me your work. Show me how you vetted this stuff. Why should help me be my own editor? And the me in those two phrases has shifted. In trust me, it's the journalist is the me. And in show me, it's the consumer, the citizen, who's the me. Journalism, this model, journalism goes from being a product, my stories, our stuff, our lecture, to being a service, How can we, the news organization, or me, the journalist, help you, the audience, answer your questions? I think that is where journalism in the 21st century is going. And the last slide. Should we care about the LA Times? Should we care about the institutions that are at some risk now? My view is probably not. In the end, I mean, if you're struggling to help somebody who can't help themselves, it may be doomed. But there are some things that reside in these institutions that I think we do care about. One is that the people who we're trying to cover as journalists are at this 18 hours a day or more. People who are breaking the law, people who are using our money, people who are at the institutions of power, whether it's banks, financial institutions, or the government. I'm not sure we can handle covering them 2 hours a night as a hobby. I think we need full-time journalists to cover full-time newsmakers. Second, I think there's something in the values that have evolved about news that is important. Top among them, but not the only ones, are that our journalists are independent, that they're not secretly working for the people they cover. When I think of journalists, I like the term the committed observer. The committed observer is the journalist is there, caring about society, dedicated, in an act of patriotism as a journalist, but their role is to be eyes and ears for the rest of us. And a committed observer, their goal is public consideration of events. And what distinguishes them from the activist is they don't care what the outcome is. The activists, the propagandists, those talking points people on cable, they're actually working for one side or another. They want one side to win or another side. They're working for this piece of legislation or that. They're interested in outcomes. And journalists are not. They're interested in a healthy process. They leave the outcomes to others. Another important value here is verification. That we are actually vetting the news. We're not just grabbing the facts that help a cause. We're trying to find out what happened. And those values may not survive if we just sort of let things happen. If the newspaper dies in a town, the city council, the zoning commission, who's going to want to cover that? Who's going to want to provide a news service? Well, who's got the most vested interest in land use in that town? It may not be an independent, beneficent, citizen-based thing. It may be a real estate group. And that worries me. And the other thing that I think we care about is an institution that is dedicated to spending money to find out what happened, to turning over rocks. So I think these are not the only things that we care survive, but these are three things that I think are important as we imagine the next journalism that we hope survive. These things reside in these institutions, and if the institutions die, we have to figure out, I hope, some way that these values transfer to whatever comes next. We can talk about this later. It'll come up in questions, but this slide talks about if advertising does die, what are the potential other revenue models? And there are a lot of them. Many of them have not been explored very much. The cable model is simply that you'd pay your fee for the content producers embedded in your access fee. You pay subscriptions to all kinds of cable channels. It's just embedded in your cable fee every month. And the cable company turns around and pays that fee to the Golf Channel and the Food Channel and Fox and CNN. Retail malls is the notion that you'd actually make transactions. You'd go to the newspaper, and from there you'd go to all kinds of retailers and services in your community, and the newspaper would be getting transaction fees from that activity. Niche products. Niche products are not specialty sites, but things that companies and industries in a given community would really have an interest in, would pay a lot of money for, and that would subsidize the more general interest news gathering. Challenging aggregators. The news business is, at this moment, finally getting to the point where Rupert Murdoch and others have talked about this, basically getting tough with Google and saying, you can't just steal this stuff from us. Google says it's not, but in fact, in economic terms, they are. Memberships is the idea of like PBS, where you solicit membership fees from your readers, and there wouldn't be a cap on it. And institutional nonprofit funding is obviously another one, and I'm sure people are going to want to talk about those things. But let me stop here, and hopefully that will be the basis of some discussion.
Terrific. Thank you, Tom. It was certainly thought-provoking. I know I speak for everyone when I say that. I'm going to hoggishly take the first question because I have to say, having been gone now from Washington for a year and away from research like this for a year, one thing that did strike me is just how legacy media focused it is, for good reason. I mean, I understand that's what you set out to do. But I want to take your point in the next to last slide when you said, you know, should we care about whether these legacy media institutions survive? And you said probably not, but then you went through a number of reasons why we should. And I guess my question to you is, now that we do know that there are people, I mean, if we think of journalism not as that which is done in a newsroom, but a form of information with allegiance to a certain set of values, obviously independence and verification, the others that we might assemble, then we do know that there are bloggers and aggregators and even enterprising investigators who are doing some of this work. Are you beginning to look at them statistically too?
Yeah. We've sponsored two major studies of all the media in given communities. One is two of these were studies that we did with Missouri and Michigan State, and what we're seeing is there are now sort of civic news sites popping up, and there is some element of repertorial work done on them, but they don't post. Most of them do not post daily. They post episodically, once a week or so is the norm. They are not covering the community in a comprehensive way at this point. I think they may have aspirations to that, but there's no, they face the same basic problem that the legacy media faces, which is there's no way to subsidize this.
But some of them, like Voice of San Diego or even the St. Louis Beacon, are definitely posting more frequently and doing.
Yes, and Voice of San Diego, which has got institutional money, and MinnPost in Minneapolis are probably the two most celebrated. At this point, what they are is, I think they're analogous to an alternative weekly in the town. They have good content occasionally, or they have good content regularly, but it's not. They're not. You couldn't find out what's going on a regular basis at anybody's city council or anything like that. It's not really beat reporting in the way that we think of a community news institution doing. It's not a kind of regular monitoring. It's enterprise stuff that is absent now often in the legacy media, but it's complementary to, it's supplemental at this point, and that's at the very best ones. We have a study going right now called City Without Newspapers, where we're taking one town for a week and examining literally every outlet in the community that contains news, from the blogs to talk radio to everything else, to see how the stories course through the community. Now, this could change. You know, as newspapers shrink, the other things will grow. But I think that my sense is, and I'm pretty confident of this without having actually done the number crunching, is that if you looked at the number of people engaged in news gathering in any of these towns, the people who are now outside in these other places would not equal the number of people who have left the legacy media. So I'm encouraged, and I'm encouraged that these places continue to have these values, but it doesn't address the fundamental problem. Whether it's MinnPost or or ProPublica, which is subsidized 100% by the Sherman, I think it's the Sherman family.
Sandler.
What is
Sandler.
it? Sandler, thank you.
It's
Long-term,
not 100%, but close.
long-term underwriting of this or financing of this is still in doubt.
Yeah, that's certainly the problem. One other point, and then I want to be sure and bring in the audience. That you said something like, this is very interesting, that the word now for media is to do what you do best and borrow the rest. Or do you? I see some media doing that. It seems all of a sudden to be true, but it's not overwhelming. I certainly don't see a lot of that in the Los Angeles Times, for example.
Yeah.
What do you see?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's harder for an institution like the LA Times. When I got to the LA Times, we basically, the attitude was, there shall be no wire copy in our newspaper. Every story in the paper was to be a byline story. Well, that's clearly changed. The Washington Post, which had a death battle with the Baltimore Sun over some sort of battleground counties, have now engaged in an agreement to share their news coverage of those battleground counties. And you'll see a Baltimore Sun story on the front page of the Washington Post. Now, that's an unthinkable thing 2 or 3 years ago. I don't think it's in any way a terrible thing. And one other thing I would say about this, we were talking about this before. The LA Times, where I once worked and once had, depending on the count, 1,400 to 1,200 editorial employees, and now has, the latest count is 550. And you can bemoan the fact that it's half the size of what it once was. But in the 1960s, when the LA Times was emerging from a dreadful newspaper and becoming a good newspaper, and on its way to becoming a great newspaper, it had far fewer than 550. Yeah. My good friend Bill Kovach says that the New York Times has, even at a somewhat diminished level, drastically more reporters than it had when he joined the newspaper in the 1960s. There are a lot of good, we see the trajectory, and it's depressing. But if we can reimagine what the reportorial press is and eliminate the sort of endless duplication that we have, the phenomenon we're facing right now, and have for the last 10 years, is we have more reporters covering fewer stories. If you have more outlets, and every outlet has a smaller number of reporters, they're all covering the 2 or 3 biggest stories of the day. So there are more people at the White House and more stories about what Obama's done each day. But there are fewer people at agriculture. There's nobody at the FCC. Sure. There's nobody at these other agencies. So it's a phenomenon of larger crowds in fewer places.
Your point about employment, there's a wonderful study by Robert Picard, who's a media economist, who looks at employment in newsrooms in this country back in the 60s. It's one of those things we all know. You can use statistics in a lot of different ways. The curve then, if you look at it, goes to this great height of employment at newspapers and then goes back down. And just as Tom has said, it isn't anywhere near where it starts here. So catastrophe can look differently depending on how you look at it. One other quick point, and that is that the borrowing the rest thing is now including student work. The Boston Globe, for example, using Northeastern's investigative reporting, and that's certainly something our students are involved in. Well, it's time for you all to be able to ask Tom questions or make comments. We'll just start right in here.
Is federal legislation required to allow the large institutions to, if you will, collude to build a self-sustaining
Yeah, I think it might be. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I suspect that some antitrust exemption might be necessary for the news industry to work in mass to deal with aggregators, for instance, or imagine the cable model, which may be a particularly problematic idea, where you'd say, okay, we're going to build in a fee for content producers that'll be built into like built into the access fee. Well, some people might say, well, that's actually a tax that you're going to use to subsidize the news business. Or would you have a level where you'd say, okay, basic news, like basic cable, and that's going to cost you, $2 in your internet access fee or whatever. And then if you want to get fancier than that, you can have more premium kind of content. Well, who would be in that basic news collection? And what would be, and who would be out? And where are blogs? And where are all these other things? And how would that be determined? That would certainly require federal activity and not only an antitrust exemption. You probably have, unfortunately, you'd have to figure out some way that there'd be a body that would determine who's in and who's out, and that's potentially very uncomfortable.
But people are attempting to do it in groups now, short of any kind of collusion that would awaken the fears, I guess. Caterly?
I have a question about hyper-local. It's been very interesting to watch my suburb of Los Angeles. The very small newspaper that exists there is doing really well.
Yeah.
They're adding pages, their advertising revenues are up, while I would venture to say in the same suburb, the people who subscribe to the Los Angeles Times have probably dropped by 50% or more. And so what does that say about the future of hyper-local? Is there a future in print, television, all of that?
Yeah. Well, where the world is going in terms of, generally speaking, is narrowcasting and niching, and the more specific, the better, because the advertiser and the revenue sources know that they're really reaching people who are relevant. We were talking about magazines earlier. Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News are suffering terribly. I mean, U.S. News is no longer a news magazine in print. It's only a news magazine online, and in print it's bi-monthly guides. I think there's a significant possibility that Newsweek will fail in the next 18 months. But niche magazines are doing quite well. In the newspaper industry, you have a real range. National newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are faring relatively well, although they clearly have some issues. The papers that are suffering the most are the big city metros, because they cannot compete for national and international news with the national news organizations. But they also can't be as local as the hyper-local, and they're caught in the middle. And it's not clear what their raison d'etre is, because the center city may not be actually enough of a news place. It may not be. It depends on the market, whether people, how many, whether it's a region or whether it's a city, and the advertisers for those big city metros all are major national operations or regional operations that have significant online presence. On the other hand, the neighborhood news organization, the micro-local newspaper, the throwaway weekly, their advertisers are not online. They really have no other advertising venue than the print newspaper or the very local outlets. And there's no other way to get that news. Nobody else is covering those, at that micro level. So the buzzword in the newspaper industry 2-3 years ago was newspapers have to be hyper-local. The LA Times was talking about hyper-local. But in fact, they can't do that. And the notion of local for a major metro newspaper, I think, has to be much more conceptual than geographic. When you buy a big city metro, you're buying a newspaper that's supposed to represent the concept of what an Angelino is. And if the paper is too parochial, people say, well, that's not me. I'd rather get my neighborhood newspaper and the New York Times and a national newspaper. That's me. I'm very local and I'm global. But I'm not this guy who just kind of lives around a few blocks of Los Angeles. I'm more complicated than that, and I need newspaper or media that's more complicated than that.
I just realized we have microphones, and we even have one of our faculty members standing at one. So, Robert, excuse me.
Thank you. It was a great presentation, and as you gave it and as you speak, I find myself agreeing with one sentence and then vigorously disagreeing with the next.
Well, just forget the ones you just gave.
I tried. And it really got me wanting to jump out of my seat. And I want to make two observations and my question. On one slide, you said that 90% of the New York Times revenue is made out of the legacy media. I want to point out that probably for most newspapers, perhaps the New York Times as well, 90% of the cost to put out that legacy newspaper is putting out newsprint and paying the truck drivers and the delivery.
No, it's not. I can tell you exactly what the numbers are.
For regional newspapers, that for ones that I've been associated with, it is very high. Perhaps not 90%, but it is significant. And you're seeing an experiment in Seattle PI, to try that out. The other thing that I wanted to point out was that news content has been evolving in such a quick speed. Every one of us is picking up a camera, a microphone. But if you look at the ad products, it's been the same. In fact, it's gotten bigger and more obnoxious. So seeing how online readers have increased, but ad revenue has gone down, to me is a little bit obvious because nothing has changed. And my question is, you talked about how the LA Times had the opportunity to buy Google, and newspapers and news outlets have squandered the opportunity to take the lead. We know this now. It's been 10 years since Craigslist has come out. What is keeping us from doing it now? I hear leadership say, oh, you know, my 12-year-old niece can really do video. And the question that I asked at the Online News Association conference last year, and it's going to happen again in a month, my question is, at what point does your 12-year-old niece become more qualified to run your website, opposed to, of course, you running a newspaper? When does leadership, what is keeping leadership from acknowledging these new skills that they have inside their building? Many of them do. What is that? What is keeping them from taking that step?
Well, the short answer is culture. It's the same reason that the shipping business shrank, because they didn't see themselves in the transportation business. I mean, these have become cliches after a point, but you know, why the railroads shrank, why the American auto industry, you know, even after 40 years of knowing what the problem was, seemed incapable of adjusting. In the shrinkage that we've seen in newsrooms, in particularly newspaper newsrooms, there has been some transition. They've gotten rid of older folks and, under the radar to some extent, have hired younger folks. So the numbers are down, but the number of people who've left is actually greater, and they've brought new people in, and those people are people who are willing to...
point out that it has age probably is one factor, but
yeah,
it's more thinking...
Well, right, yes. But they're looking for folks who understand the technology, who are embracing it. I would say that, and there's two other factors. One is that there's more energy now in the newsroom about new technology than there is on the business side in most news organizations, in most news companies. I hear this over and over and over from the business people. Publishers who say to me, I see the deer in the headlights look from my advertising staff, not my news staff. Why? Because newspapers and television stations have thrived by servicing very large institutional advertisers. I said in a class earlier today, the most important qualification for being an ad salesman at the LA Times in my era was a low golf handicap. You really wanted to service these guys who brought in a lot of money. Google, on the other hand, makes its money from a million little ads from places that are small advertisers. I said this earlier in a class also. You can go on Google and in 10 minutes or 5 minutes, give them your credit card and buy search advertising on Google. There is not, as of a few months ago at least, last time I looked, there was not a newspaper in the United States where you could go online and on your own put ads on their website. You had to call an account executive.
There are a handful. There are a handful, and there's a vendor coming out trying to do that.
So your knowledge is ahead of mine on this, but it's a profound cultural problem that they cannot seem to shed. If I were to bet, and I hope I'm wrong, these institutions will die. That's why I think it's important to identify the values inside those institutions that have a civic value that we want to have survive. If I were to guess what's going to happen is you're going to see these institutions shrink and shrink and shrink, and small micro sites begin to evolve, And 15 years from now or so, somebody's going to come along and say, you know, it's inefficient to have all these microsites. Let's put them all together, and a large regional media will re-aggregate itself. And it'll be the kind of people who can survive in this new culture.
You think
but let me just say one other thing about the point that you made about printing and delivery. Industry-wide, the printing and delivery of print costs 40% of a newspaper's cost. We've looked at this pretty hard. If you were to get rid of your print edition and go online only, you could probably save about 50, in some cases 60%. The news operation of a newspaper costs 15% of your cost, but that's just the reporters and editors. You still have HR, you still have legal, you still have administrative, you still have all those other things that any company has off the manufacturing floor, represents another 30 or so % of your cost. And those things don't go away. You're still going to want to have a marketing department. Probably want a better marketing department than you've got now.
Unfortunately, legal has been going away.
Yeah, so people look at this and say, well, shoot, if we could just have the news operation, we'd only need 15% of our costs. Yeah, that would be great if but somebody has to cut the checks, too.
Thank you.
Do you really think all of them will be gone, or do you think a few show signs of adjustment of these legacy newspapers?
Oh, I mean, no, not all of them. I mean, I was making a ridiculous broad brush generalization that you shouldn't make.
I guess we should be going to the microphone. Yes, hello, Susan.
Hi.
Go for it.
Hi, how
Sarah.
are you? I teach writing and reporting in the undergraduate core here at Annenberg, and my question relates to that. I know you're an educator as well as a journalism leader, so I'm hoping that you can sort of put that hat on for a moment.
Oh, those are both probably exaggerations. Go ahead.
As journalism undergoes what you described in your talk as a shift from product model, excuse me, to service model, should that shift in model affect the way we are teaching the basics to our journalism students, writing and reporting? And if so, how?
Boy, you know, I think that I think the next generation is already there in terms of service. You know, I think when you move into when you first decide, when the glint goes in your eye the first time that you tell somebody a story and you make a connection and you see their eyes light up and you think, wow, I like doing this. What Jim Carrey called communication is community, where you're creating community by passing along information. I think that younger people get that service dimension, maybe better than people my age. What I think we need to educate in is a variety of things. One is, what are the core values that we want to have survive? And how do you fight against the biases of new technology that might erode those? Every technology has its own biases. Television has an emotional bias. Print has a kind of an abstract, conceptual bias. It's hard to make print people tell stories well. It's hard sometimes to make TV people not be afraid of abstract ideas and heavy concepts in TV pieces. The biases that we see in the newer technology, among them is, and we talked about this in Bryce's class today, one of them is speed. The internet is so focused on the easiest thing, the thing that distinguishes it, which is you can do stuff right away, that it's easy to get sloppy, because speed is the enemy of accuracy. The less time you have to produce something, the more mistakes you're going to make. Another bias in the technology is specialization, and we're more likely to write for specialized audiences in a way that other people can't understand, that's exclusionary, that is bifurcating or something fricating, because the technology lends itself to that. So we want to make sure that the values that we think are important in journalism, that it's inclusive, that it's clear, that it's evocative, that it's significant, that it's verified, that those things that journalists do that are not, that distinguish it from other media, and distinguish it from the discussant media, that those things survive. And it doesn't mean you teach the basics the way we always have. It means you figure out a way to make sure that those basics are performed well. I think that the technology that we're looking at now offers us the chance for a much superior journalism than the old media did. I have a slide in a different presentation where I say if you were going to cover this event in print, there are 6 elements that you could bring to the coverage. You'd have your main narrative, maybe a sidebar, headlines, graphics, photos, and maybe a pull quote. If you're going to cover an event online, my current slide has 56 elements that you could bring to the coverage. Now, the challenge of that is you can't bring all 56 to every story. So we used to build our houses here with a hammer and a screwdriver and a handsaw. Now we've got all the power tools at Home Depot to build this house. But we need to know which tool is right for which task. So journalism has actually gotten much more sophisticated. We got to get out of medieval medicine and get into modern medicine as journalism people.
I would actually say one of the biases of the technology today is inclusion, which of course can help counter the inaccuracies created by speed and counter the exclusion. I mean, the web is extremely inclusive.
Yes. No, I think that's true. When I meant exclusion, I meant you have these very narrow channels that not a lot of people are seeing.
Yes, Sandy.
What do you see, Tom, as the impact, or what have you seen so far, and what might you imagine, given the trends, the impact on long form? Long form, people talk, well, people don't want to watch for very long online. They don't want to watch a long piece or keep clicking through to read. What do you sense, not only from that, but what the implications would be for that?
We just got a lot louder. I see evidence. I'm still a lot louder. I see evidence of.
This must be a big thought.
Not bloody likely. I see evidence of real health for long form. I mentioned those Barack Obama videos on YouTube, and it may be discomforting to some that he's producing his own videos and all that, but the 1 minute 30 pieces that you saw about Barack Obama on the nightly news, or the 2 minute debate panels on cable news, on YouTube, he had 7 and 10 minute videos. In magazines, Time and Newsweek are suffering. The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's are thriving.
Harper's isn't making money.
No, but
it's a form of thriving,
right? Relative to what it was, to where it was, and I think that's because their elite media in general are doing somewhat better as people see the general interest media suffering. It's the same thing that people think that the Washington press corps has been shriveled dramatically. That people are cutting back on their Washington bureaus and all that other stuff. We did a study on this and found that the total number of journalists in Washington is about the same as it was. But many of them were working for niche elite newsletters. Often people who had been covering that beat for the Washington Post no longer covers it, and they've gone over to some electronic newsletter called Climate Wire or something else. CQ now has 36 online newsletters, and all of which are profitable and are aimed at a professional and trade association audience. What we think of used to call the trade magazines, but these are now sort of journalists who you'd think of as very highly skilled journalists who had once worked for a general interest press. So it's part of this sort of niching of the audience where, if you want to find out in this culture we have right now, if you can be better informed than you've ever been, but the quality of your local newspaper may be diminished.
Yes, over here.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. So earlier you spoke on that there's the writers or the people in the newsroom, and then there's advertisers. And traditionally, I would say they've always been two very separate groups. But our industry is changing. The media is changing, and journalism students are now going to talks like these that are focusing on the major trends in media and the business side. For graduate students, I'm a first year, and for our curriculum, do you think that we should start having classes that speak a little bit more about the business, or should we just focus on the writing?
I do. I mean, not everyone is going to be entrepreneurial in their nature, but I think there are two big reasons that you want to do this stuff. Three, maybe. The first one is that you may be actually out on your own. You may be creating your own website. I mean, some of us here know Nikki Fink. She used to work for the LA Times. The idea that Nikki Fink was going to sell, create... I mean, Nikki Fink, in some ways, might have been unemployable, so she created her own website, but now she's rich. Nothing wrong with that model. The second reason is that even if you're working in a larger institutional setting, we need to reinvent the business model. And I think journalists want to be involved in that. I don't think we want people who are strictly business people who don't understand journalism to invent the revenue engine and then tell us the journalism that we want, that we have to produce to support that. It needs to be organically connected. The best news, the notion of the wall and the separation of church and state was always a myth. It was always overstated. The publisher always, crossed both sides. And the very best news organizations have a single mission. And the business people believe in the journalism mission, and they support each other. An organization where the business side is at odds with, undermining, dissing, or bad-mouthing the news people, that's not working for anybody. And the organizations that operated that way have stumbled. At the New York Times, on the days that a major event happens, that the president gives, typically the president gives a press conference or a major speech, the Times knows that it's going to want to run a full transcript, at least it used to, in the newspaper. And for years and years and years, when that happened, the advertising department would close down ad sales on those days and enlarge the news hall because they felt that that was important to the brand of the New York Times, that it was a newspaper of record. And the advertising people did that willingly, not grudgingly, because they believed in that notion of the newspaper of record. They thought in the long run that helped the business side. They had a single mission, a joint mission. And I think that as we struggle, if we're going to find a new way, it has to be a joint mission. The third reason is that if you don't understand business in the newsroom now, and Geneva can speak to this more eloquently than I can, you will be rolled. The idea that you're going to say to the business people, even 10 years ago, go away, what, you breached the wall, go disappear, you shouldn't be here. Well, that's a losing argument. In fact, we lost that argument in the news side.
Got rolled. Kevin?
Yes, you spoke critically about Google at the end of your presentation. I was wondering first if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean about Google being sort of, I don't remember the terms you used, but the way that they're taking advantage perhaps of mainstream media. But also, how do you reconcile this sort of ethic of do what you do best and link to the rest, and the link being this primary powerful source or currency on the web, with this relationship with Google, being critical of Google, and trying to negotiate between creating content, being a news organization, and needing to work with Google. Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about it?
And I may have overstated it. I think what needs to happen for the news industry is that they need to share in the revenue of the search ads that run alongside the search at Google. Google's viewpoint is, by and large, we're driving those people to your websites, and you can sell advertising there. That advertising isn't working. It's shrinking, and it's, for reasons that I talked about a little bit, we can talk about more if you want, that display advertising isn't working. Google said it wouldn't sell search ads on Google News, but now it does. basically, and it's in Google's self-interest. Google likes to think of itself as a very good corporate citizen, as good guys. Google guys think of themselves as good guys. But they're going to have to basically, if they want the news industry to survive, as they say they do, they're going to actually have to give up some of the revenue they're going to have to share revenue that is now theirs, I think, or the news. And the other thing that needs to happen is somehow the news industry could, en masse, opt out of Google, and there could be no news searches on Google. There's a code, I'm not a technical person, but where you could basically say you can't search our site. And all news organizations in the United States could opt out of Google searches and create their own search. It would probably require an antitrust exemption to do this, but call it Newsel. And all the revenue from all that search advertising would go to the news industry. That theoretically could happen, but for all kinds of cultural reasons and the fact that there probably are maybe a total of, 400 programmers in all of the newspaper industry combined versus
and they probably
how many,
don't know the code.
Right, versus how many are actually how many programmers are there at Google? Thousands and thousands and thousands.
Yeah.
So, we don't have the capacity to do that. So the news industry needs to partner with Google from a posture of aggressiveness and not on their knees.
Do you think we have the leverage to do that?
I think they have the anger level now.
That's a step.
That's something. And I think that Google, A, wants to be perceived as a good guy, and B, recognizes that it is in their interest that the news industry thrive, that's part of their business, and that if it shrivels, that's not good for Google in the long run. So I think we're not quite at a pivot point, but we're moving in a direction where, look, there are people in the news business who think that if they just keep waiting and the recession ends, advertising will eventually come to their websites. And if you travel around local newspapers, you'd be amazed at what, at the level of disagreement about what's going on.
There are others who think that if they just find the right e-reader, it'll be their solution.
Yeah, there are. And the news industry, I think if I were going to make one prediction, I would say there isn't one single revenue fix that's going to subsidize or take care of this. In the same way that there wasn't one category of advertising ever in the newspaper business or in the TV business that sort of subsidized everything. It was always this hodgepodge of stuff that people like Joseph Pulitzer and others said, oh, well, let's try this and let's try that. The idea of, well, let's try this and let's try that, somewhat kind of stopped in the newspaper industry.
When they were rolling in dough.
Right. Somewhere in about 1965 when they said, well, let's not try anything because we don't need to.
Let's just keep on trying the same thing because it's really working. Yeah, we have time for one last question. And is it all right if we take it off the mics? Or can I persuade some of these people in the middle of the room?
We have two hands.
Two in the middle of the room. Okay, we'll start with the red dress and then we'll go behind the red dress. Yes. Kathy.
Business side actually looking at all the different ways to generate revenue from the information we're already producing. As you pointed out, our issue is not news or that people are no longer interested in news. In fact, they seem to be more interested than ever. But it seems to me on the business side, nobody's actually looking at our customers and looking at innovative ways to reach advertisers, reach individuals who might be interested in all these things, and I think there are a million different ways to do it. As you said, I mean, the business is fragmented. The advertising model is what it was in the 1960s. Is anybody actually studying it and coming up with ideas?
Well, there are smart people who are engaged in this and worried about it. There was and I could cite different projects. There was a project called Newspaper Next where they got some folks from, was it Princeton or Wharton, a couple of different places. And they came up with some really, it was historical. They talked about other industries, and they talked about, you know, what you need to do is figure out what service you really provide to people, what function you serve in their lives, and build on that. But then, and it was API, who's got some pretty smart people guiding that, that nurtured it, and so the American Press Institute. But then they gave it over to newspapers to try and do stuff. And it sort of slowed down to not much at that point. Now, there are a variety of reasons for that. One is, you know, you're busy cutting and you're in the middle of a terrible recession, and then you've got all these cultural things that are going on. And another is a culture where, you know, the idea that, hey, well, let's come up with 55 things and, you know, 45 of them will fail, and that's good, you know. That's just so antithetical to the way that newspapers have operated. And then another major part of this that was a surprise to me is that the advertising industry and the retail industry and all these other industries, they also are being buffeted by all this technology.
Absolutely.
The Madison Avenue is as terrified and stultified by what's going on as we are in the news business. So that's an industry that's dominated by TV people who have sold major advertising accounts to television, and even the print side of those businesses are now kind of the tail on the animal, not the head. The TV really dominates, and they don't know what to do about the internet. So that's one reason they've been sort of slow to adapt. And they say, which metrics do we use? And there are 5 different rating agencies, and they're all a little different. And so there's a lot of things sort of thwarting this. And if people say, well, show me who's doing something that's working. Show me an example of something that's where people have kind of figured it out. Well, there aren't any, because it requires multiple sort of components to work. I would say Newspaper Next was onto something, I think, with the idea of what is the service you provide. When you think about what's a newspaper, what's function does it, or a news organization, what function does it serve in its community? It's not in the writing stories and pushing them out to people business. That's how we performed the service, but it really wasn't what we were in the business of doing. More fundamentally, we were in the business of acquiring knowledge about a community and gathering that knowledge in, and then figuring out a way to disseminate it. If you think of it that way, there's a host of things you could potentially do. It's easier for me to say this in up here on stage than to imagine what all those things could be. But there's a host of things that you could do. Essentially, that's what Google did. They said, wow, there's all this knowledge. You could aggregate that. How would you do that? And what are the businesses you could make out of that? We need to think about the news business in a ground up, from the bottom up way like that. Okay, what is it news is? It's not narratives. We're not in the writing narratives. We're not just writers. We are doing something bigger than that. And we got to strip down to a conceptual level what it is, and then say, okay, what are all the ways you could potentially build business models out of that? Is there anybody who's been given the chance to think about deeply and with the commitment of the news industry in that way? Is there a Bell Labs or a Skunk Works for the news business? No, not really. There are universities that aspire to it, but they're also in the business of doing a lot of other things, principally educating students. And there are smart people out there. They're scattered, and they're kind of all working in the same direction. But the revolution is not organized.
I want to keep our covenant to get people out of here. So if you could ask a very brief question and give a very brief answer, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right, sure. Working? All right. You mentioned the 6 characteristics of a responsible news person. And I'm a first-year grad student, and a lot of us are trying to find out what kind of journalist we want to be. But one of the things you mentioned was that we as journalists should be sort of playing a role model. But I was thinking, assuming the role as a role model, can that be a little dangerous and destructive in a way, sort of like a local news anchorman acting pretentious and becoming a laughingstock because he's acting as a role model? Wouldn't that be a little dangerous to assume the role of telling people and assuming that we're right?
Well, it's a little bit like athletes. You know, athletes, particularly the bad boy athletes, will say, I'm not a role model. Well, they are, actually, whether they want to be or not. We perform a public function, and in doing so, we are a role model, whether we intended to be or not. And I think, I've looked at the data on public perceptions of the press going back from, when the surveys first began to be done in the early 1980s. And basically what it boils down to is people don't think we're living up to what they expect us to do. They sense a lack of our meeting our professional aspirations. When I mentioned role model there, it was simply that as citizen journalists move into doing journalism, they're going to naturally look to us to see how we do it. But I think there's another level of role model, which is people expect the press to perform in a certain way, and they're disappointed. They're disappointed when we pander to them. They're disappointed when we exploit the news. They're disappointed by tabloidization. It doesn't mean they don't consume it, but they consume it and can lose respect for it at the same time. We need to be mindful of that. I think the bigger issue is we need to reinvent the business, and they'll respect us for that.
Well, audience, thank you for your questions, and please join me in thanking Tom.